based on the expert judgment mostly. And aside of classifying the business license, the impact of the risk-based licensing also impacted to the frequency of the monitoring. So the higher the risk of the activities, the more frequency of the supervision or the more frequency of the monitoring will be done by the inspectors. So why transparency and accountability really matters? Because risk-based regulation or risk-based licensing somehow alter the focus of the regulators from preventing all possible harms into controlling the greatest potential threats to achieve regulatory objectives. So somehow in the risk-based regulation, the regulators will focus more on the high-risk activities, will monitor more on the high-risk activities instead of controlling the low and medium risk activities. So the problems becomes what if the environmental impacts come from the cumulative effects or cumulative impact from the low risk activities that not be controlled by the regulators. So this is why the transparency and the data transparency and accountability really matters, because it can hinder the regulatory capture for sure, and it also can help the public to understand more about the compliance, for example, the compliance for the business activities, help the public to understand about the condition, the environmental condition in their surrounding area. And therefore, the public can do the public monitoring, and the public can help the government to do the monitoring as well. Because this is really important. How can the government, for example, really control all the business activities? Meanwhile, we still have some homeworks, for example, like the capacity and the amount of the environmental inspectors, for example. So the role of the public really matters now, because the public can help the government to monitor the compliance from the business activities, can help the government to do the public monitoring. And that's why the public shall be provided by data, shall be provided by the information to do their job. And the public's role also, and our regulation also mandated the public to have more role in giving recommendations with regard to risk level of the activity, to provide data and information related to business activities during the risk determination. So actually public shall have more role in the risk or in the baseline stipulation. So we also note that the public participation will not be meaningful if there is the effectiveness of access for information. So like learning from New South Wales, for example, who already implemented risk-based licensing for years, they really opened one map data, one map initiative already effectively done, effectively conducted. So therefore, the data, for example, like the permit documents, environmental inventory, or even the compliance history, for example, like audit report or logbook, can be easily accessible for the public. So public can also monitor and help the government to stipulate the risk level of the activity. And this is some of the lessons learned from the New South Wales, that we see actually how the risk-based licensing, how the data is really opened, and how the data the transparency and the accountability can help the effectiveness of risk-based licensing process in the New South Wales. But maybe Matthew will explain more about this. But still, I still have one more left. But I would like to discuss that. What are the challenges that we see right now? Okay. Instead of the aside of information and data management officers that's still not functioning properly, the effectiveness of the One Map initiatives, one very basic and fundamental challenge that we see is the different perceptions between institutions regarding public documents or public informations. Based on ICEL research, there is different perceptions for one institutions and other institutions about which data that should be open for public. For example, one institution said that, okay, environmental impact assessment or environmental permit, for example, is open for public. But in other way, when we go to other institutions, they say that no, environmental impact assessment is not open for public, for example. So different perceptions between institutions that we see is one of the challenge that will hamper the transparency and accountability process in achieving the effectiveness of risk-based licensing. And this is my last slide, the ways forward that we hope that system integration will be essential actually to achieve the the effectiveness of risk-based licensing, and therefore one map initiatives and one map data shall be strengthened. And one basic or one fundamental things right now is the ways forward is how we can strengthen also the understanding of the stakeholders regarding the public information. So therefore there's no differentiates between differentiate of the understanding between one stakeholders and others about which data should be or shall be open for public. I think that's all from me. Elizabeth, we can discuss more in the discussion session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Greta. You didn't have a poem, but you had a very informative presentation. So that's just as good. So before we move to the next speaker, I just want to remind our participants that they can be asking questions throughout these entire presentations. If your Q&A button is hiding, you will find it under the 3 dots, more. If you click on that, you will see there is a Q&A function where you can write your questions as you hear our speakers. And with that, we'll move on to our third of 5 panelists who will be giving their speech. The next person to speak, I believe, is Matthew Bard. Matthew, let me just, get to my notes. Has over 30 years of experience in environmental and planning law in Australia and Asia. Since being called to the New South Wales Bar in 1991, he's been at the forefront of environmental litigation, including climate change and environmental crime. He's acted as an advisor on environmental law with the Myanmar Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation, and as an advisor and member of the Permanent Secretariat of the Technical Working Group for Cambodian Ministry of National Resources and the Environment. Based in Southeast Asia for the past 12 years, he's conducted professional development workshops, training materials, and training sessions with a number of organizations, as well as for judges, lawyers, civil society groups, investigators, and prosecutors. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth. Selamat pagi, assalamualaikum, sawadee from Thailand. So in answering to the challenge of the poem, I can only recall a poem from William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over valleys and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, something that has reminded me of the joys of nature. I also want to thank the organizers for the opportunity of being here, and in particular, Greta and Indarini from ICEL for the overview that you provided for the New South Wales risk-based management process. And risk-based assessment in New South Wales has been used as a reason, I think, for Indonesia to move towards looking at risk-based licensing of properties and facilities. And I think it must be considered in context, because I think a number of the issues, and certainly the issues that have arisen over the need for promoting more sustainable development within Southeast Asia. And I also acknowledge the passage of the Omnibus Bill last year has also focused on some of the issues, but not necessarily all of the issues. And I fully agree with Greta in terms of her exposition about the role of access to information, the role of procedural rights, access to information, public participation, access to remedies as being fundamental to the exercise and the application of a risk-based assessment process. And I will look at that in the context of New South Wales, which has been in place since 2016. But this system was predated by, of course, the environmental assessment, the environmental impact assessment process, and a very complex system of environmental assessment that has been, and planning assessment, that has been going on for all businesses and all industries in New South Wales, certainly since the 60s with Pollution Control Law and the 70s for the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which provided environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment planning, as well as approvals for all licensed facilities, for all polluting, for all industrial facilities. So before they get to the risk assessment process, they have to go through an environmental assessment and approval process. And this is fundamental because within this environmental assessment process, we have a number of those requirements that were mentioned before in terms of public participation, access to information, transparency of data. And what has, I think, been very important in New South Wales is we have a surfeit of environmental data. I used to take people in Cambodia and Myanmar through the processes looking at particular projects to see all the information that is available on the New South Wales Planning Portal, the New South Wales Environment Portal, and I would often use a hot sync from mobile phone from Naypyidaw, this was before the coup, to go through all of these systems to show them exactly what sort of information was available. And within the environmental assessment process, we had standard systems of screening and scoping, which were all public and open. They were all advertised so that all community knew what was going on. We had, of course, a complex zoning system that meant that certain activities were simply prohibited. And those activities, especially industrial activities that had pollution issues, were there to be assessed. There were disclosure of information, mandatory public participation. The review of the EIA was open. Those materials and those documents, the comments from other ministries were all available. There was an approval process. The approval itself, the recommendations was a public document. The environmental compliance certificate were public documents. And then after that, we had monitoring, compliance and enforcement, which included compliance with all of the conditions of the environmental assessment or the environmental compliance certificate, as well as an environmental protection license that was issued by the Environmental Protection Authority. So you can see that before we get to risk-based assessment, we have significant public participation, significant data transparency, significant access, and it is all available, and ongoing availability of reports and pollution reports, compliance with license conditions, and breaches of those license conditions enabled prosecution by the Environmental Protection Authority in the local court or in the Land and Environment Court, and penalties of up to 5 million Australian dollars or about 4 million US dollars, and daily penalties of up to 100,000 Australian dollars or about 80,000 US dollars. So these were significant penalties, including jail terms for directors and managers who may be responsible for deliberately or willfully causing pollution. In addition, they had a range of options about compliance enforcement. Now, in terms of the process, the Protection of Environment Operations Act from 1997 established the regulatory and licensing framework under which the risk assessment tool was developed, which covered all the day-to-day operations, the risk of a pollution incident, and the environmental management performance of the licensee. It also followed the principles contained in the Australian Standard of Risk Management, and the international standards could also be applied. The aim was certainly to focus that the protection licenses issued by the Environmental Protection Authority should receive appropriate level of regulation based on the level of risk they pose to human health and the environment. But it was certainly a way of focusing regulation on those most likely to cause significant harm. Hence, there was the site-specific risks posed by the activity and identifying, but also the character of the licensee and whether the licensee had had any breaches or prosecutions in the past. The licensing system ensures that the environment protection licensee receives the appropriate level of regulation, but it does not mean that those premises with a low risk are not regulated. They still have the same level of regulation, but not the same focus during the management, the enforcement, and perhaps the investigation. It provides a stronger incentive for compliance. It ensures that the Environmental Protection Authority is well equipped to regulate high polluting facilities, but it ensures also the community is provided with increased information about the industry performance as well as the potential risks. So the complexity of the system can be made more simple in terms of recognizing that the environmental risk assessment, which is seen in the middle of this slide, follows the environmental assessment and approval. It follows the issue of the Environment Protection License and the pollution licenses issued by the Environment Protection Agency, that they have then factored in certain pollutants, a licensing fee to allow those pollutants to occur, checking that those pollution licenses are in accordance with relevant standards. And then the environmental risk assessment takes those into account and identifies the environmental management category of the premises, at which point all premises still need an annual return and they are assessed annually. But those premises with an environmental management category of high risk receive the most amount of focus. But there is continual monitoring, and overall environmental risk is published on the public register. Rita showed the maps there. So it must be seen that in the New South Wales context, the risk assessment follows the public assessment process. It's not a substitute for an environmental management plan, an environmental compliance certificate, and environmental protection license. It requires compliance with international standards. Impacts on the community and the environment are considered. It considers the environmental reputation of the licensee, so poor performance does result in higher fees and charges, and breaches of the licenses will be prosecuted, which could involve premises being closed and the licenses being suspended. There are about 2,500 activities in New South Wales which are subject to this, and it must be remembered that New South Wales has a population of 8 million. It has a GDP of $560 billion, which is about 50% of Indonesia's GDP. It's about a third, of Australia's GDP. But remember the population, 8 million in New South Wales compared to 25 million in Australia to compared to 270 million in Indonesia. But in terms of the focus and assessment for those 2,500 premises, all premises are licensed. All licensees have to produce incident reporting, response management plans, and submit annual statements of compliance. It must be acknowledged that the system here is not a substitute for proper environmental assessment, nor is it a substitute for lack of information and lack of access to data. It complements all of those issues to ensure that those procedural rights of access to information, public participation, and access to remedies, including prosecution, are all there. But more importantly, it integrates the polluters pays philosophy within the whole risk-based assessment so that those who cause the harm will be punished and will pay for that harm. Terima kasih. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate you were exactly on time. That's very impressive, making my job as moderator very easy. Our next presenter is going to be Luisa Arumingitis. She is a journalist from Mongo Bay. She started her journalism career in 2015 with Jawa Pos in Jakarta, and she currently works as a freelance journalist, as I said, for Mongo Bay, Indonesia, covering the capital city, Jakarta, and its greater areas, Louisa has been involved in several collaborative investigative projects and received a number of reporting grants, including from Internews Earth Journalism Network in 2019. So with that, Louisa, we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Maybe presentasinya. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to me. Sorry, I will present in Indonesia. Hari ini saya akan.
Today, I would like to present and to reflect how in the last October, we have launched a report related to oil palm, and we see how the data that we have compiled and analyzed, it has a view of the losing potential of the forests and the country's loss. We collaborate with Tempo and Beta Hita Indonesia, and we also collaborate with Nusantara. So we at the beginning, we see the anomaly of the tax revenue when the area of oil palm is improving, but why the tax revenue is decreasing and even stagnant. It can be seen on the table on the left. Our first hypothesis is the oil palm in the forest, and the government said there is around 351 hectares that they do not pay tax. But after we do field research and we also verify our data, apparently there are parts of the oil palm plantation is illegal, which means even they still pay tax, because in the regulations in Indonesia, it allows oil palm plantations who has permissions that they can pay tax. So even though our first hypothesis are broken, we still count the overall potential of tax loss from oil palm plantation in Indonesia. So the method that we use is tax potential calculation, property tax, value-added tax, and corporate income tax. We see that the data in Indonesia is not open. So we use data that is available from NGOs and independent farmers. So we use the mapping from different organizations. So we create a modeling from all Indonesia. We use 32 sample concessions from 8 provinces that has the biggest area of oil plantation. It becomes the aggregate how the tax loss potential that is made nationally. We also calculate the value-added tax based on the productivity numbers of oil palm and the fruit bunch, fresh fruit bunch, from the corporate income tax, because the independent farmers, the tax is only implemented for farmers that has more than 25 hectares. So we have difficulties here. We need to separate which plantations who are paid tax and not. So from this overlay, we calculate how much is the potential loss. The comparative data, we see it from the tax directorate.
Pajak bumi bangunan atau tax property ini.
Jadi tax property,
PBB ini menjadi yang sangat krusial ya.
Tax property is crucial. It's because it's the basis of the tax calculation and its derivatives, including value-added tax and corporate income tax. If the tax property has some problems, it can influence the value-added tax and corporate income tax. We see that there is a potential loss that is about 2 trillion per year. While for the value-added tax, it's about 4 trillion. And from the data that we have, there's a conservative and ambitious calculation. This is the corporate income tax. We calculate we see plantations that have an area more than 25 hectares, and it's about 18 to 23 trillion per year. From the analysis that we do, we calculate that there is a potential loss for tax revenue for about 22 to 29 trillion per year. This data is based on our analysis based by researchers and media collaboration. So we see that this potential loss is equal to 169 million of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And if the data is open publicly, we can really calculate the actual potential loss. But since we don't have the open data and we only do a model based on the available data, this is one of the case study that we have. And this is the Lancet that we do with the NGO. We find some verifications to the field, not only from data. So this PAU corporation is developed their oil plantation that operates in conversion in protected forests. We assume that if these people report their tax, but there is a leak to the areas that's not part of their area. And the tax office also mentioned that from the KPPA system, there are leaks. And even the Riau tax office, in around 3 million oil palm plantation, is only 1/3 is recorded. You can also see if there's a bad governance, it can also sell to international market. This is the end users for the oil palm. So we have talked about there is a potential loss for tax revenue. But this tax is the externality of the forest that has been converted. What's important from the governance is the forest that has been losing, because the forest is very important for the people and for general. So what data are needed? The issue of oil palm governance has been done a lot by the government, but the implementation that we are waiting. There is this one map policy, but unfortunately, this one map policy does not go as planned. If the data is open, it will be very helpful for researchers and journalists to see the real and actual potential loss for the tax revenue. And also the society can see. That's all from my presentation. Thank you, and back to you, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louisa. That was even under your time allowed. It very efficient and kind of appropriate when I guess you're talking about tax policy to be efficient, right? Anyway, great. So for our last speaker, before we move to two respondents, we're going to hear a pre-recorded message from Ms. Adna Karmegek-Oates. Adna is the Senior Program Officer with the Open Government Partnership, or the OGP, which, as you all I'm sure are well aware, since it is their 2021 Global Summit, they are a partnership of global reformers and civil society advocates working to make governments more transparent, participatory, inclusive, and accountable to their citizens. ADNA specifically supports the OGP government, civil society, and other stakeholders who leverage the OGP to advance reforms in priority thematic areas. So with that, let's hear the message from ADNA.
Well, hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Adna Karmegek-Oates. I'm with the thematic team at the OGP support unit, and I really appreciate the invitation on behalf of the organizers to this session to represent the OGP to discuss the urgency of transparency and accountability of natural resource data in environmental risk management. I'm sorry that I'm not participating in the session live today and instead pre-recording. This is because I'm based in London, so with the time difference, it was just too difficult for me to join live. But I wish you a very productive session, and I know that with colleagues such as Tanti and Liz with you today, they can answer any OGP-related question certainly as well as I can. So as many of you probably know, we are about halfway through OGP Summit week now, and I hope that you have been able to join some of the sessions that have been part of the summit. It's great to see the open government community convene and use the 10th anniversary of OGP not only to recognize, but also re-emphasize the enduring value of open government in improving the lives of people. And what we're hearing throughout the sessions is that now more than ever, when we're faced with significant global challenges like rising authoritarianism, the pandemic and all the inequalities that its mishandling has deepened, climate change, with all of these significant global challenges, open government is an absolute necessity for better governance. So today I've been asked to speak about how members of OGP are using open government approaches for the context of climate change, one of these big challenges. For the topic today, specifically for the topic today, how they're using natural resource data, transparency, and accountability of data for that context. So I'm going to provide a few specific country examples of that. Specifically, I'll be talking about Peru and Ecuador, which have two interesting commitments that I'd like to share with you. And then I have a resource at the end of my presentation that has a lot more information. So allow me to share my screen if you just give me a moment. Sorry, not going as fast as I would like it to go. There we go. Okay, I think you should see my screen right now. So I know that many of you are probably already very familiar with OGP, and I don't need to go necessarily into many of the details about how OGP works and what OGP is. But one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is the process of dialogue and the process of co-creation, which is really the fundamental aspect of OGP and why we are here in the first place. Fundamentally, it's about the model, right? Because it requires the dialogue between government and civil society in order to arrive at reform commitments. The reform commitments, the policies themselves are, of course, important. The substance is important, but I dare say even more so it's the process and what that relationship then that it facilitates and engenders between government and civil society, and what it then also says about the quality of governance and responsiveness of government to its people. So just as a reminder for, or very quick intro to those that are not as familiar with OGP, this process of cycle of 2 years, which is being adjusted at the moment to a longer time frame within the OGP. But essentially, it's at the beginning of the co-creation process, it's this idea of coming and arriving through dialogue and collaboration and consultation at a specific set of policy commitments in different thematic areas that are then implemented and are supported by the OGP support unit, including myself. And then all of these plans are, their design as well as their implementation are independently assessed and the results publicly shared, which is an important accountability component of the OGP. So in terms of the types of commitments through this process that we're seeing among OGP members that directly address the climate change context, I want to highlight two commitments in particular that are very relevant for the topic of the session today. The first is Peru's 2019 commitment titled The Interoperability of Environmental Data Disclosures. And so what is this commitment essentially trying to do? The issue in Peru is that environmental information is quite disjointed among various agencies within the national government, as well as different levels of government, which then also translates into different methods of categorizing and publishing the data. And there have been some advances in terms of interoperability, but it's still, when this commitment was put forward, it was still very much a problem. And that's why it was proposed to be part of the action plan. This commitment is aligned with the strategic vision of the Ministry of the Environment. It is also addressed within the OECD recommendations for Peru, which suggested that Peru needed to improve the quality of its environmental data. And to do this, the ministry has a public investment project supported by the World Bank, which will help with a data center for the environmental sector. So all in all, this commitment is set up quite well in terms of having national prioritization, multilateral support, as well as a funding mechanism behind it, which is, admittedly not nearly always the case with OGP commitments. One thing I should have mentioned about the interoperability is that the commitment doesn't just try to improve interoperability at different levels of government, at the national level, but also at the regional and the municipal level through the strengthening of regional information systems. So this commitment is nearing its end. We don't have a full report on completion yet. It'll be a little while before we do, and the independent reporting mechanism can send somebody in and to look at the impact and the actual results. So I don't want to maybe go too much into progress because we don't have information on that yet. We do have some early information from 2019 and 2020 in terms of the percentages of people accessing the information that was being made available through this interoperability process. And that has shown a significant increase, so that is positive. One of the drawbacks of this commitment is that its design was still sort of targeted at existing or regular users. Let's say universities, researchers, and decision makers, which were systematically using it, but are now using it even more. CSOs, for instance, have said that interoperability was the one and only goal, that improving access and dissemination was not really the goal. And we can see that the commitment doesn't have references to dissemination campaigns or communication campaigns that would allow for such a strengthening of access to information for citizens beyond those regular users. The next commitment that I would like to talk about is Ecuador. And this is also from the 2019 action plan, which refers to the implementation of the Escazú Agreement. So for those not familiar, the Escazú Agreement is the regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the agreement seeks to guarantee the full and effective implementation of the rights of access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. Along with 8 countries in the region, Ecuador ratified this agreement in May 2020. So there's many important aspects to the Escazú Agreement, but in terms of transparency and data, it requires publication of the state of environment reporting, which usually covers the health of land, air, and water. On the right to information, it ensures that countries should reactively and ideally proactively make available information on species, air, land, water, and human environmental health. Currently, this kind of information on environmental matters is pretty limited. There's a ministry that has a system for the management of information, but a lot of that is about environmental impact assessments. Information, let's say, on the management and use of natural resources, or on the definition of projects or norms or strategies of socio-environmental relevance is quite scarce. So the potential of Escazú of expanding the kind of environmental information and data available to citizens is therefore quite significant. This commitment is about implementing the Escazú Agreement through open government approaches. So, doing a collaborative process with civil society of planning a roadmap or putting together a roadmap on implementation. So I'm going to wrap up here because I think I'm over time. But one of the things I wanted to post here was a new resource that the OGP support unit released right before COP26 with the purpose of providing some guidance for OGP members on how they can implement the Paris Climate Agreement through open government approaches. And there's a robust section on transparency and exactly on this topic of natural resource data that should be published and available in the context of climate change. I've asked Tanti to share it in the chat, the link to this resource. And I would love to have follow-up conversations with country stakeholders that would be interested in how they might take up some of the recommendations. Thank you very much for your time. And I again apologize that I'm not with you in person, but I'm sure that you're having a great session. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Adna, for that informative pre-recorded message. Hopefully you can all hear me, yeah? So we've just had 5 really incredibly informative presentations, and we're now going to turn to 2 respondents to react. But I just wanted to quickly sort of summarize that we've heard about how transparency and accountability are essential at a regional governance level for implementing risk-based licensing, for tax reform, and then you've just heard from Adna other countries' examples of where they have really tried to leverage open data. So we've really been able to cover quite a large breadth of strategies and opportunities for using natural resource open data. I want to encourage people to be thinking about potential questions. If you're having trouble putting them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom features, then you can also try, if you have access to the chat, when we get to the Q&A session, we can also think about having people just sort of share their questions online, and you know, just sort of we can potentially try to unmute you. Please don't hesitate to either write or speak your question in either Bahasa or English. We have the ability to sort of speak and answer in both. So with those house break sort of breaks, housekeeping breaks, turn to our first for his reactions. Dr. Fridolin Burek, he is part of the team at the Strategic National of Corruption Prevention at PKRI, Indonesia's Anti-Corruption Commission. Fridolin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Lisbeth. I'm from National Secretary of National Anti-Corruption Strategy of Indonesia. I have 3 points of view about this webinar, but I'm speaking in Bahasa. One is about the linkage on OGI. One point is about linkage of OGI and digital transformation. Second one is about one data and natural resources governance in Indonesia. And the last one is about oil palm tax inequality in Indonesia. Okay, terima kasih.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, what I would like to respond is related to the open government initiatives and the digital transformation. We all know that open government initiative is a global initiative, but this is the work from different parties, and we should acknowledge that the challenges are in the government who needs to shift from closed work to an open work. In relation to the digital transformation, there are several steps for digital transformation. First is implements of digital transformation, that the government is present as digital entity. And you ladies and gentlemen can see in every government that there are websites that give information. That's digital presence. Second is in the interaction stage, where we can interact. However, what we have really entered is the level 3 and 4. Level 3 is transaction stage. It
completely online, avoiding a trip to an office. Okay, itu sudah bisa, tetapi kita
So that is stable, but we haven't really entered the transformation stage, that the public can be involved in government's administration, including decision-making process. We're not in that level. Therefore, here are several advices for OGI. How do we encourage the transformation to the 4th level? And in the 5th level is the participation stage. In the open government initiative, it just opposed in digital era. Indonesian government talk about Indonesian mission to be world-class bureaucracy, but if we are not ready to provide information, it's hard to even achieve the 5th level. That's the first point. The second point is related to natural resources and one data. From Mongabe have also talked about government's policy about One Data Indonesia, but again, it is related to mindset transformation, particularly for One Data and natural resources. We know that there's regulations for transparency, but this regulation said that all palm data is the one that is not included. That's why the information about natural resources has challenges. I have written an opinion in Kompas newspaper about the depth of transparency, information transparency. And the Forest Watch won a court case that the government opens the data for HGU. And the question is, if we relate it to one data, there is a scheme, regulation scheme, that there is one data that is excluded. And there's a there are several basis data for one data, such as spatial and statistic data. And for the spatial data, we still have difficulties. I still remember in 2013 or 2014, during the national strategic from Bapenas, around 2013 to 2014, we decide that the ministry, that they finish all the maps and thematic maps, and until this day, it's not finished yet. That's why we need to find new solution, because since using the regulations, there is a worry from the government that when the data is published openly and people know that it is used by the government, the society will know, but it needs to be challenged. Is it true? People also encouraged to open the data on contract, but it's still on discussion. The third point, but I believe the speakers from Mongabay has already talked about tax for oil palm. There is data. If we ask for the area offices, if we ask, they will have the same question. If we ask about plantations, there are about 2,000 tax, but in the tax office, it's only less than that. There's a discrepancy around 13 tax object that is not listed. From mining sector, around 300, but in the office tax only 316. There is like around 6 discrepancies. There is a discrepancy as well. That means there is a discrepancy in data. So when we talk about transparency and accountability, we are following the One Data protocol. The One Data protocol starts from where? So it also relates to the digital transformation of the government. First, we talk about the business session, about the selling data, about the interoperability between institutions. Is what's the purpose? If for the digital transformation, there are some government platforms and other governments. In the context of natural resources, there are 3 data that should be published: spatial data, the ownership of plantation, and again, if we would like to integrate the 3 data, that we need to find a standard or one certainty about the business process or the OPAM. That's all for me. I'm sorry if there are some questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Fridolin. So we're reaching the official ending of our webinar, but I'd like if people have a few more minutes to stay on so that we can hear from our last respondent from Wali Riau and then have a closing statement. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate your time and hope you've really enjoyed these incredibly informative presentations. The final respondent is, as I said, from Wali Riau. It is Boy Jerry Evan Simbriing. So Boy Jerry Evan, if you would like to come on and have a quick opportunity to share your reactions to the presentations that you heard. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I will respond the topic with bahasa. Kami di Walhi sangat percaya bahwa
Us from Walhi believes
keterbukaan informasi itu merupakan
the openness of information is quite crucial. But in this regime, there's a contradiction from the openness of information and the public participation. If we see from ISEL that they said that risk-based, that after the regulations, the public space reduction, data to information, but there is not a space for participation. It's nonsense. That's also a thing that should be done by the Riau province government. There are also lots of notes for Riau province in the special committee that regulates the plantation that violates some permissions for oil palm plantation. That is the first priority. If we are encouraging the open of data, if we don't open the public participation, that is not fair. The society will only know about the challenges in data, but they don't have the ability, particularly for economic problems, for the Malay locals that has in relation to the social aspect and economic aspect and cultural aspect. And it's not fair if they are not given space for participation, especially when we talk about the openness of information that only focus on ministries. And I also agree with the previous speakers. But these are some of the data that's excluded. And the fourth one, I want to respond about openness of data information. And we'll think about the public access, especially for the society. We cannot compare it to people in the global north. How about the society in the villages? If the data is only open, there is a valid data, but people don't really have the access to the data. They cannot open the data. It's also difficult. Lastly, we would like to convey that there's other contradiction. There are changes in permissions, such as the KPI, and it should be synchronized with the government regulations. That's very important. It's more than a year, and we haven't really transformed and synchronized our technology. Another contradictions that I would like to convey. We talk about openness of data, access and participation, but there is a strategic national for openness of information. It's kind of difficult if we face. I just would like to convey that.
Great. Thank you. I think those are really important points, especially about public access. And it really actually resonates with the work that WRI did with ISIL, MediaLink, and Wally. One of the findings we really found was that despite having these open data platforms and right to information, there was really a remaining gap between what information was supposed to be available and the information that was available. So I think that public access gap remains a really important question. So if people are willing to stay for just a little bit longer, we do have a couple of questions that came in. We also are trying to answer questions that people are typing in online live. So please look to the answered questions on that link as well. But if everybody can turn on their cameras, let me just ask this question and then we can just sort of quickly go around and get people's quick reactions. So the question that we have is from Zamran, and it's: disclosure of information will be meaningless if it's not accompanied by civil society's understanding of the value and meaning of the data. Who is responsible for bridging the public's understanding of that data? And how do you avoid bias when perceiving that data? So if anybody from the panelists or respondents would like to answer that question, again, on who's responsible for bridging public's understanding and avoiding bias when looking and perceiving that data. Does somebody want to take it?
Maybe I can just start first.
Great.
Yeah, just like the general comments of PBB say that actually the indicators of the effectiveness of access for information is not relies on whether the data has been open for public, but whether the public has understand the information or the public has understand the data itself. So it's actually becomes one of the main role from the government. It's not only the central government, but it's also the local government to really to educate the people, for example, or to bridging the understanding of the information that shall be really easily accessible by the public. But not only the government itself, for sure, but it is the role of the CSOs as well. CSOs as the guardian of the environment, CSOs as the CSO who to assist the communities in understanding the information. We know that there are many data, there are many informations that are hard to be absorbed or hard to be understood by the communities, because, for example, how the communities can really understand the environmental impact assessment process, environmental impact assessment documents, for example. But that's why the participation or the engagement of the civil society in every decision-making process is really essential, because civil society can take the role to bridging the process. I think that's my comment, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I agree. Matthew, did you have something you wanted to add?
Thank you. I just wanted to also sort of question this idea about people's understanding of information and communities. I mean, most decision makers don't understand the information that is presented in a raw data, and we all need it to be interpreted. I've practiced environmental law for 40 years, but I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a pollution expert. I can tell if something is exceeding a standard. And so I think that that's also where it is important to say that all information, and it is the obligation of the person who wants the project approved to be able to explain it to both the community, but also the decision makers, our politicians and our regulators, to ensure that they also understand the full impact of what they're approving or what they're considering. But this also highlights the vital importance of the role of civil society, of industry groups as well, who can talk about the value of this, but also the media, and the freedom of the media to report on these issues is vital. And one of the things that we are facing across Southeast Asia in particular is the criminalisation of freedom of expression and the challenges to the media in reporting on environmental information. And that then leads on to the threats of environmental defenders. And this is where, in terms of Indonesia and the environmental law in Indonesia, We see, a great example of legislative provisions that say that every person has the right to an environment, and no person who is arguing for that right should be liable to a civil and criminal offence. This is a leading aspect or a leading clause of regulation in the region, but it needs to be followed by not only the government of Indonesia and the provinces, but also other countries in the region. So we have to make sure that the information is available, but then is available to be talked about by journalists, talked about by civil society, talked about in the press, and that those who talk about environmental harm and environmental issues are not penalised or subject to pressure and violence and murders, as we've often seen in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important point. We have so much to talk about, and I'm so sad that we have run out of time. We have one more question that if you will all just indulge me for a little bit longer. That question is as follows. Natural resource management is inseparable from the agreement between government and private sector based on private law. How is the transparency of the Natural Resource Management Agreement based on private law in practice? Anybody want to take that? We have a few lawyers on the panelists that I know can answer that question. Even if you're hesitant to speak again, please jump in. Or maybe one of if the Riau province would like to speak to that as well. No? Yeah, please, Matthew.
I mean, I can again just to say that we are facing ecological catastrophes. We're facing climate risk. We're facing biodiversity loss. We're facing continuing environmental degradation, and that means that the private sector has a fundamental obligation to disclose its information, whether on the terrestrial or fisheries or coastal zone or the marine environment, such as deep sea mining. If industry wants to continue to have its operations without strong regulation and strong oversight, then it must disclose. These are obligations not just in the UN Guiding Principles, but the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, and it is in our law. Industry want to do things and they claim it creates jobs and doesn't destroy the environment, then they must disclose their information. And once that information is disclosed, then we can make, regulators and decision makers can then decide whether or not the benefits outweigh the harms. Thank you.
Yes, Greta.
Yeah, just a little addition, because this is a long discussion, I think, because some of the parties think that the open data or open contract will hinder the competitiveness of the business, because it will, spill, quote unquote, spill the data from the private business and make their competitors know about that. But that actually there are some clauses and some norms in our law number 14. It's about the public information documents that actually gives some assurance that that resources management agreement or contract, for example, shall be open for public. And we also have some initiatives, for example, some of the agreements, some of the procurement agreements that can be open for public as well, and some of the public information commission's decision that already mentioned that natural resources management agreement shall be open for public. So I just would like to emphasize that we don't have to be afraid that the open agreement or open contract will hinder the business competitiveness and some sort like that. But we believe that it's actually will increase the accountability and will increase the effectiveness of the business. That's my little comments, Elizabeth. I think.
Great. Well, since we started with poetry, I don't know much about poetry, but I do have a famous quote by an American poet, Walt Whitman, which is, "We were together, I forget the rest." So I think that that might be a good general theme for this question and the need for both private sector, government, and civil society to work together to make sure that data is open, available, and accessible to all. And with that, I will turn it back to Tanti or Greta to say goodbye. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this very informative session. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Global Summit. With that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So I think this is my a closing statement for from me and for all of the participants from the committees. We would like to very much thank you for the government of Riau and for joining us today in the panelists. We would like also thank you for Matthew, for Lucia, for Elizabeth for sure, for your very inspiring leadership during the session. And ISAL and MediaLink and also WRI would like to say thank you for all of the participants and all of the fruitful discussion for today. We really hope that all of our discussion today can be fruitful for our advocacy in the future. So we are very sorry for any inconvenience, and we really hope that we can meet you in person in the future for it and in the next discussions. Thank you very much all, and good morning from Jakarta. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Matthew, Lucia, pemerintah Riau.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Ya, Elizabeth. Hilang Elizabeth dah. Hilang ya. Malah dah nengok asisten.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Asisten ya. Sampaikan terima kasih semuanya. Pak Afrido, terima kasih. Sampaikan salam dengan teman-teman di.
Terima kasih teman-teman.
Jam 10 malam Elizabeth.
Terima kasih dan Olivia.
Saya izin
Recording
ditutup ya.
stopped.